Good afternoon, scholars. Today we have with us Dr. Peter. The second name I find it very difficult to pronounce. Dr. Peter, welcome you on behalf of Philosophy Department. He's an Anglo-Scandinavian philosopher of mind who specializes in the thought of Whitehead, Nietzsche, and Spinoza, and in the fields pertaining to panpsychism and altered states of mind. After obtaining his degree in continental philosophy at the University of Warwick, he became a philosophy lecturer in London for 6 years, and after this, he pursued his PhD on Penchantine monism, a version of monism, examined by Galen Strawson and Joel Kruger at the University of Exeter. He is now a research fellow and associate lecturer at University of Exeter. Today, he will talk about Spinoza's metaphysics with an emphasis on its monist panpsychism, which is a theory of related to sentience, like consciousness to some extent, you can say. And he will also touch upon certain issues relevant to contemporary philosophy of mind, such as problems of mental emergence and mental causation, with reference to thinkers such as J. Kim and A. Whitehead. So on behalf of Philosophy Department and all the philosophy community here in Delhi, I extend welcome to you, Professor Peter. Welcome once again, and over to you, please.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I should thank the Philosophy Department, the University of Delhi, thanks to Sahana for contacting me and organizing this. So yeah, I'll be talking about then Spinozism and the philosophy of mind. I'll say this, it's part of research that I'm doing at the University of Exeter related to Spinoza and unusual states of consciousness. My PhD, as you mentioned, was in panpsychism, a form of panpsychism, that mind is ubiquitous. So one of the original panpsychists, as I will explain later, was Spinoza, the greatest philosopher of the modern age, Einstein said. But I'm going to talk about Spinozism in relation to issues in the philosophy of mind, old issues and some new issues, and also relate it to the ecological crisis. Because my main argument is this: the hard problem of consciousness, which I will go into in a moment, and the ecological crisis, which I'm sure you're aware of, share a common cause. And that common cause, I will argue, is Cartesian dualism, the dualism of Descartes and its legacy. And I will argue, and this is where this kind of hypothetical metaphysics becomes practical, that they share a common solution. And the common solution is Spinozan monism, or Spinozism for short. So that common cause then of the hard problem of consciousness and the ecological crisis hopefully will be explained as I explain what Spinozism is, how it relates to the mind, and thus how it relates to the world. So let me start with sort of talking about the so-called hard problem of consciousness. And I apologize for those of you who are intimately aware of this. Some of you will be, some of you won't, I assume. So this will set out some of the problems in the philosophy of mind and how Spinozism can be seen as a kind of solution to them, or a path towards a solution. So the hard problem of consciousness, so-called, was coined by David Chalmers in 1995. But it's an old problem, really. I mean, it's also known as the explanatory gap, and it goes back to Leibniz and Leibniz's mill in the Western canon. And ultimately, Schopenhauer says it goes back to Descartes himself. What is it? Well, in Chalmers' original piece from 1995, he says, the main problem is one of emergence. So he says, how is it that mind can emerge out of matter, or the brain? How can mind come out of meat, as it were, to put it crudely? How can things moving, how can motions cause or make occasion thoughts or curiosity or desires and so on? They seem to be radically different things. That's the original. So the hard problem of consciousness is originally framed in a kind of emergent vocabulary, but really it's I think today it really means more than that. It's really about the relationship between mind and matter. So is that relationship one of emergence then, as Chalmers originally assumed? I mean, Chalmers has changed his mind since then. Is it that mind somehow comes out of neural matter due to patinations or whatever? Or is the relationship between the mind and matter one of substance? So this is Descartes' view that there are two fundamental substances which interact, the pineal gland for Descartes. Is the relationship one of psychoneural identity? So and this was common in the mid-20th century, when we talk about mental states and when we talk about neural states, are we really referring to the same thing? In the 20th century, the psychoneural identity theory was really a physicalism. So by the same thing, they meant the physical underlying matter. Is the relationship between mind and matter one of psychophysical as opposed to psychoneural identity? This is more in line with Spinoza. So when we talk about mind and matter, are we talking about really the morning star and the eastern star, both with the same reference, Venus? This is the way I will argue with Spinoza in a moment. But also the hard problem of consciousness involves questions about mental causation. Is mental causation possible? Can a desire cause one's body to move, for example? Or can a calculation result cause writings on a piece of paper, on a computer? It seems that they can, but this is very problematic in terms of causality. If there is no such thing as mental causation, is mind simply an epiphenomenon? Something Aldous Huxley's grandfather, promoted, that all mental entities, too strong a word, are all mental phenomena, basically sort of products of physiological machinations which don't have any efficacy in themselves. Problem there is, of course, why would they have evolved, as Karl Popper said, Bradley said, and so on. Is the relationship one of pre-established harmony? It seems quite out there. This is Leibniz's solution. Is the relationship one of common cause? So mind and matter are both caused by something common to both, as in, for example, neutral monism. Or is one of them simply reducible to the other completely? So from one side, you get eliminativism, that there actually does not exist, the mental does not exist at all. And on the other side of that spectrum, you get absolute idealism or subjective idealism, which is that matter doesn't exist at all, and there's only mind. So anyway, there are no obvious solutions to this explanatory gap between mind and matter. I mean, a lot of people think they know what the solution is, but no one really agrees. And I remember going to this towards the Science of Consciousness conference in the past, and everyone's very furious with each other because they all think they know exactly what the answer is, but they don't agree. So I think at the very least, one has to admit that there is an issue upon which people do not agree. Now, I say that the hard problem of consciousness has a common cause, at least in the West, and that then, as Schopenhauer really said as well, that is Descartes' metaphysics, Descartes' dualism. So I'm sure most of you know what that is, but for those who don't, Descartes was a French philosopher who lived 1596 to 1650, I think, died in Sweden, my mother country, of cold, I think. He argued that mind and matter were then completely separate substances. They interacted in the center of the brain, the pineal gland, as I mentioned, but this was never really agreeable, even to his contemporaries. And he sort of admitted that he couldn't really work out this relationship. But nonetheless, he felt compelled to argue for this dualism, partly because Pope Leo X issued an edict for thinkers to prove two things: that God exists and that the soul exists, against incoming threats, intellectual threats. And this is what he does, for example, in the Meditations. Tries to prove the existence of God through the ontological argument. Another one, and he tries to prove the existence of the soul as separate from the body, and therefore very parsimonious with the church thinking, because of course, if the soul is separate from the body, then it can exist after the body's death, and thus be judged accordingly by Christian doctrine as to whether it will end up in heaven, hell, or limbo. So this was very conducive to church thought. Also, I should say, Descartes' philosophy was very conducive as well to the progress of science in the West. Ironically, the Cartesian legacy is was very conducive then to originally mechanism, theory that everything ultimately is matter, and then that sort of developed into materialism and physicalism. These are just, you can see these as synonyms. Some people don't. Some people say physicalism differs from materialism after Einstein. It's neither here nor there. It's a linguistic issue. But why would, paradoxically, Descartes' dualism lead to a mechanism, that really a material monism, that everything can be explained by matter? Well, that was because of his view of the physical world, which he, as a mathematician as well as a philosopher, said was geometric, and thus could be understood through mathematics alone, and in terms of particles and laws of nature. Thomas Kuhn, the great philosopher of science, in his book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where this classic term paradigm shifts is coined, he writes this, quote, normal science is an attempt to force nature into the preformed and relatively inflexible box that the paradigm supplies. After Descartes' immensely influential scientific writings, most physical scientists assumed that the universe, sorry, the postman, thank you. Most physical scientists assumed that the universe was composed of microscopic corpuscles and that all natural phenomena could be explained in terms of corpuscular shape, size, motion, and interaction. So not only was Descartes' philosophy very conducive to church, Christian church, but it was also, and he was Catholic, I should say, the largest denomination of Christianity, of course. It was also very conducive then to the so-called new philosophy. And at that time, philosophy and science were not separate realms. However, one can see Descartes' dualism, Cartesian dualism, of mind and matter as a kind of trigger for the dualism between religion and science as well. Because where religion, where the soul sort of turned into the concern for religion, the salvation of the soul, whereas the body became the concern of what emerged from natural science turned into science, as natural philosophy turned into science as we know it, concern for the body. And so mind and matter were then separated not only metaphysically, but also in terms of disciplines. And they were left originally to concern for themselves. But eventually, of course, the mechanistic route became very dogmatic, and they said, well, you know what, maybe there isn't a soul, or the soul is just can be explained purely through the body. And then you got, a lot of French philosophers who took this to extremes, where you get Gassendi, a contemporary of Descartes, and D'Holbach, and Delametre, who wrote Man is a Machine, I think, or a book called Man as a Machine. And of course, this fed into the science we have in the West today. And of course, this philosophy, this science of mechanism, understanding nature purely geometrically, this for Descartes was extension, physical space as pure geometrical space. This led then to the Industrial Revolution, because it was very conducive to creating machines, because it thought of the universe as a machine. And eventually, and it's interesting to look at the history of that. I live here in Cornwall, in the southwest of Britain, and one of the first connections between the mechanistic philosophy and industry was related to the mines here. All around me here are these sort of remnants of these tin and copper mines, which the area is quite famous for. Anyway, little did they know at the time that, of course, this exploitation of nature would lead to sort of the destruction of the world and become a threat to humanity itself. So one can trace, and this is not the only cause, of course, but one can trace one etiology, one causal line from Descartes' dualism to the ecological crisis. Now, a few decades after Descartes flourished, a Dutch philosopher, or a Jewish Dutch philosopher, Spinoza, flourished. Spinoza lived 1633 to 1677. He was Jewish. He was of the Sephardic Jewish, so that meant that his heritage came from the Jews who were expelled. Well, they came from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal. They were asked to either convert to Christianity or leave Spain originally, and then Portugal. And this started the Spanish Inquisition, because some people didn't believe that some of these Jews were really Christians. But anyway, many of these Sephardic Jews moved up north, many ending up in Amsterdam in Holland, because it was a very liberal city and very accommodating, relatively speaking, to the age. And so he's brought up there in Amsterdam. But in his 20s, he was actually excommunicated by his fellow Jewish community because of radical views he held. And then he realized that what he believed, what he wrote about was very controversial. So he published anonymously, and he was published posthumously. His greatest work, The Ethics, I think it's his greatest work, that was published on the year of his death, after he died. So Spinoza, I believe, his philosophy was much more parsimonious than Descartes. It was a solution to Descartes in a way. He published a book on Descartes' philosophy and taught Descartes' philosophy. He knew it intimately, but he also saw its defects. And so his philosophy can be seen, his metaphysics at least, can be seen in a way as a solution to the problems seen in Cartesianism. However, these solutions were not agreeable to the powers that existed at the time. So in Amsterdam, there was a strong Calvinist power structure there, Protestant Christianity. And so not only was he, someone even tried to kill him, not only was he excommunicated, he was also banned, his works were banned by the church. And for 100 years, to say you're a Spinozist was akin today to calling yourself a fascist or something like this. It was just a faux pas. You would lose your job, your accommodation, all social respect, status, and everything. But then in the 1780s, 100 years after he died, really, erupted in Europe this great intellectual phenomenon called the Pantheism Controversy, where someone, Jacobi, accused someone else of being a Spinozist, which was a big no-no, of course, at the time, and then Mendelssohn waded in, and then the whole intellectual community of Europe really got involved. And after that, Spinozism was more studied and led to Kant. I mean, Kant referred to him. Hegel said philosophy starts with Spinoza, and so on. But in terms of the general zeitgeist of the time, which means spirit of the time, his philosophy didn't really have much of an impact. It was seen then as philosophical interest and had influences on philosophy, but not really the wider world, as Descartes' philosophy actually did. And the reason for that is really the suppression of the church on Spinoza's philosophy. So it's interesting to note that Christianity really, in a way, is one important causal factor of the kind of scientific outlook we have today. So it's not as if science and religion are completely opposed. They actually have an interesting common cause. Spinozism is not anti-scientific in the slightest. It's just another way, it's just another axiomatic framework upon which hypotheses can be based, as opposed to the unwitting, subconscious Cartesian framework upon which a lot of science today is based. Not always, but quite often. So what is Spinozism then, and why was it at least so controversial, and how can it help solve hard problems of consciousness and ecological crisis? Okay, so I've actually, if you want a more detailed explanation of this, I've created a synopsis on YouTube. It's just, if you type in Spinozism synopsis, you should find it, only last week. But I'll give you the outline to those of you who have never come across Spinozism before. I know it does, I've got vague notions that it overlaps with a lot of ancient Indian philosophy, and so I would ask you to please excuse my ignorance of this. Western philosophy is large enough, and I really haven't got time to even read a fragment of that. But I'd be interested to hear any overlaps later. So Spinozism then. So as opposed to Descartes' dualism, Spinoza offers a monism. In other words, the fundamental substance of reality is only one. For Descartes, it was, well, two. Dualism means two, of course, so the mind and matter. For Descartes as well, there was really a third substance, which was God, as a creator of mind and matter, human mind and matter. But no, for Spinoza, there's just one substance. And he calls that substance, that one underlying reality, God, or he also calls it nature. So in other words, substance, God, and nature are synonyms. They are the same thing. They refer to the same thing. And of course, you can understand this immediately got him into trouble. Because if you're saying that God is nature, well, many of his enemies accused him then of atheism, because they said, well, you're simply denying God. You say God doesn't exist, only nature exists, and you've just renamed nature God. And so he was seen as an atheist then in the 17th century and 18th century, and this is why he got into a lot of trouble, because at the time that was a very serious accusation. And today, even a number of people call him an atheist. And I suppose if you believe that theism must mean that there exists a transcendent God, he is an atheist. However, I don't think that's quite fair, as I will explain as we go along. So there's one substance, God, nature. In other words, well, let me put it this way. That substance can be viewed, can be grasped for humans in two ways. And that is as thought, or secondly, as extension. So by thought, he means sentience, consciousness and subconsciousness generally. And in fact, his writings on sentience are quite original in terms of looking at the subconscious, one of the first thinkers in the West to look at it, really. And by extension, he meant physical space. And there is some controversy as to whether he meant space as opposed to matter, which is unresolved, really. But anyway, so this one substance, God, nature, can be viewed in terms of the matter around us. It can also be understood as thought within us. But there are, for Spinoza, an infinite number of attributes. Humans then are very limited in our access to reality. We only have these two attributes of an infinity. And duration, this is a bit more speculative, but duration, our sense of time, is a product of looking at God, nature, substance in this particular way through thought and extension. Now, what that entails then, so that has serious implications. So first of all, if you call God and nature the same thing, you're basically saying that God is nature, which is known as pantheism. Pantheism was coined by mathematician Joseph Raphson 20 years after Spinoza's death. And that's why it was called Pantheism Controversy thereafter. If you're going to say that thought and extension are different attributes or expressions of the same thing, you are going to say that they are then the same thing. As I said, this is not a dual. There are not two substances, there is one substance. And this means not only that the human body is identical to the human mind, like Hesperus is identical to Venus, same planet. It also means for Spinoza, and he's explicit about this in one part of the Ethics, that every aspect of physicality, every aspect of physical space has its parallel mental aspect. So this, he didn't use the words, but today this is known as panpsychism. It's also known as parallelism. And panpsychism, I should say, and one of the reasons I've recently got back into Spinoza is becoming a very, I'd say, popular, not popular, it's too strong, but it's becoming looked at again. I mean, it was you see it in ancient Greece, and you see it through Leibniz and Fechner and other great thinkers of the past. It sort of went out of fashion in the 20th century because that's when I would say mechanism materialism really had its peak, but it's coming back into philosophical debates again, partly because of the hard problem of consciousness. There's just no agreeable solution to this. So in one sense, you can see Spinozism as a panpsychism. Thought and extension are the same thing, or mind and matter are the same thing. But because there's an infinite number of attributes other than mind and matter, you can also call this a neutral monism. Because when we talk about substance, God, nature, you don't merely mean mind and matter. You mean much more than that, an infinite number of other attributes, as I said. So although, it's right to call him a panpsychist, but with the qualification that mind and matter do not exhaust the nature or the accessible nature of God or nature. So that means, so one of the reasons that that's was so controversial, of course, is because ostensibly it meant that there is no life after death. There's no soul separate from the body, which, of course, was not particularly conducive to church doctrine. It also looked as if it was a denial of God himself or herself or itself. One of the reasons I said it was perhaps a mistake to look at Spinoza as an atheist is because substance, nature, God has this attribute of thought, and that thought, every attribute is infinite in itself. So there's an infinite number of attributes, and every attribute is infinite. And so there is an infinite thought, what Spinoza calls the infinite intellect. And so this is not, I don't think it would be fair to call this atheism. Pantheism is fair. But of course, the infinite intellect is as similar to the finite intellect, our human intellects, as infinite space is similar to the human body space. In other words, radically dissimilar. Spinoza says, God doesn't love you. He's not a personal God at all. He doesn't hate you either, but it's not an emotional God. He can suffer no passions because it is perfect. But nonetheless, it's not nothing. It is, as I say, an infinite intellect. Now, another aspect of Spinozism, which for most probably doctrines of Christianity was abhorrent, was his determinism, which often was conflated with atheism as well. So determinism, the view that everything that happens is determined and cannot be otherwise. Why is this for Spinoza? Well, two main reasons. First of all, for Spinoza, following a sort of ontological argument, which you can see in, well, classically Anselm, but also for Spinoza, Maimonides, the great Jewish theologian, and Descartes. God is perfect, and therefore nature or the universe or reality must be perfect, which means it has perfect laws of nature, and these cannot be transgressed. Therefore, a person or a being is not free to change the perfection of God. That's one aspect of his determinism. Another aspect, which perhaps is better called fatalism, is that in itself, in other words, independent from the human mind, God is eternal. And by eternal, he means timeless, outside of time, not infinite within time. Now, that's why he's also immutable and so on. Perfect, complete. Therefore, from this perspective of eternity, the past and the future, as it were, exist as one. So Spinoza's monism is not simply one of mind and matter and God and nature, but it's also a monism of past and future. And because the future, as it were, at least from a divine point of view, exists, the future is existent, which means one cannot change it again. So therefore, there is no free will in Spinozism. And this ultimately means no one's really responsible for their actions. And for Spinoza, this was actually part of his virtue ethics. When one can see everything as necessary, one loses one's sense of blame and anger and envy and so on. All these emotions or passions, as he calls them, that make one suffer. This is something Einstein got out of Spinoza, and Schopenhauer for that matter. So ironically, for Spinoza, a sense of freedom is achieved by understanding that everything's necessary. There's no free will for the reasons given. Free will is often believed, he says, because of an ignorance of the causal factors that led us to our actions. So because we don't know why we desired this or that, we think, therefore, it must be free. But of course, really, it just shows a lack of knowledge rather than any freedom in reality. So there's no free will, but freedom is achieved by understanding that reality more and more so, as far as humans can. But of course, even that freedom, even the desire to get rid of one's passions, that's determined and so on. There's no way out of it. But nonetheless, he does. But by reading Spinoza and scientific literature and so on, one at least achieves a sense of escape from believing that things could have been otherwise. And this is very consoling. And this is ultimately the psychological purpose of his book, Ethics. That's what it's called, Ethics. It's a virtue ethics. Its purpose is to bring tranquility of mind. Spinoza famously doesn't believe in final causation, teleology, but he does believe in the conatus. There's the fundamental essence of a being is conatus. In other words, a striving to persevere, to survive. In an earlier work, he even talks about a will to power, akin to Nietzsche, but not in his later work. And in a way, you can say, well, that is teleology, isn't it? There's a desire to persevere. That is the end goal. And in a way it is, but even that conatus is determined. So there is one, I think it's fair to say there's final causation exists, but it's not free. So a determinism, a reduction of God to nature, a fatalism, a pantheism, all of this was not really in the interests of power structures of the West. Cartesianism was. And some people see Spinoza as an arch rationalist and sort of opposed to religion and so on. It's not quite true as well. There is, at the very end of the Ethics, although there can be no soul surviving the corpse, at the very end of the Ethics, the book The Ethics, he writes about this state of being which has vexed most Spinoza scholars. It's very interesting reading about this in the literature because everyone has a different interpretation. But ultimately there he says, he writes that there is actually a form of immortality, but it's not temporal. It doesn't exist after the death of the body. But he calls it it's known as, he calls it the intellectual love of God, amor Dei intellectualis. And it's quite ambiguous, this aspect of the text. And as I say, everyone has a different interpretation. But my interpretation, based on its historical legacy partly, is that it is a state beyond the first kind of knowledge, opinion, beyond the second kind of knowledge, which is reason and science. It's the peak state of the third kind of what he calls the third kind of knowledge, intuition, whereby one doesn't understand things conceptually and rationally as one does in science, but one understands things directly. So it's a pure exposure to God, substance, nature, which brings the ultimate tranquility of mind, according to Spinoza. Now, you can trace this as a product of a long discussion in medieval and Greek philosophy, starting with Aristotle. In Aristotle's book, De Anima, on the soul, he talks about, in one paragraph, Aristotle talks about the fact that one can temporarily enter eternity, timelessness. A lot of theologians in the medieval times found this very confusing. It didn't really coincide with Catholic doctrine. I mean, Aristotle was very influential in the Catholic Church, Catholic theology especially, but it led to Maimonides talking about something very similar to the intellectual love of God as a fusion of the finite mind with the infinite mind. And Spinoza, in an earlier work, a short treatise, says there are two kinds of parallelism. There's the human mind with the human body, that's normal, but there's another form of parallelism, which is the mind with the universal body, with the universe, being then this extreme form of, I think consciousness is not the right word, but this extreme form of being, which mitigates the fear of death. And that's, again, it's ethical virtue for Spinoza. And I can talk about, I'm actually writing an essay on this for a book. And I can talk about that in more detail later if you so wish. But anyway, so there's the whole metaphysics of Spinozism. It's a panpsychism, it's a pantheism. It's more parsimonious than dualism. I think most people accept that. Most people, everyone says Descartes was wrong. I mean, I feel sorry for Descartes, really. But this rational, parsimonious, harmonious metaphysic was suppressed, unfortunately, then. And if it were not suppressed, as I argue, it might have mitigated our exploitation of nature. But maybe it's not too late. One of the a great Norwegian philosopher who died recently called Arne Naess, he founded what is known as deep ecology, which is a movement, an ecological environmental movement, which says that, you know, the solution to the ecological crisis is not merely to drive less and eat less meat and so on and so forth, and create technology to mitigate pollution and whatnot, whatever. It must be on a deeper level. It must involve a deeper level of respect for nature, and of course that's been very influential. And it's interesting to read Arne Naess because he is a Spinozist, and he writes, for example, this from 1977. He writes, quote, "No great philosopher has so much to offer in the way of clarification and articulation of basic ecological attitudes as Baruch Spinoza." So this is, I think this is worth promoting. This is not just speculative metaphysics, but that now has practical implications for one of the sort of the universal crises facing all of humanity. So coming back to my original argument then, the hard problem of consciousness and the ecological crisis share the common cause, which is then Cartesian dualism, which can be then perhaps partly solved by adopting a Spinozan monism. Why? Because it fosters a respect for nature. You're looking at nature as God, as a divine entity. It's an apotheosis of naturalism. It's ultimate naturalism. And it's looking, not only is it seeing the whole of nature as God, but it's also seeing every being as being sentient. In other words, and being sentient means having conatus, a striving to persist in one's being, which means valuation. So there's intrinsic valuation within nature, within plants and all beings, in fact. So we shouldn't see nature as merely instrumental to human values, with the belief that only humans do have values. But with this sort of reframing of our understanding of nature, we can see the whole of nature as alive, sentient, not merely a machine, as Descartes had it. I mean, Descartes thought only humans had souls, not even other mammals had souls for Descartes, except for magpies. Inconsistency on his part. But that's the ultimate stage of reductivism, really, I think, which then led to this mechanism, which led to exploitation of the natural world, which led to ecological crisis. It's a pity that Spinoza was suppressed, but of course this was a necessary thing from his own philosophy. And but now, with the dwindling of the power of the church, at least in Europe, I think we can see a return to Spinozism. Well, that's my hope anyway. And I should say this as well. Of course, Spinoza is not, I don't think he's a perfect thinker. I mean, he did not include the theory of evolution in his thought. I mean, the theory of evolution is not contrary to his thought in any way. But when you do add the theory of evolution to his thought, you end up with a thinker such as Alfred North Whitehead, who can be seen as a kind of neo-Spinozist and a process thinker. And he does allow for creativity, freedom, and nature. So there's an interesting overlap between these two thinkers. They're sort of compatible as panpsychists in one way, but incompatible as determinists. With the philosophy of mind, I should say maybe a little bit more that than for Spinozism, just to finish then. There cannot be emergence from matter to mind. The great the great philosopher of mind Jaegwon Kim, who died last year or 2 years ago, he said that this emergence is a huge problem, really. It's not like emergence in any other way in which we understand emergence. I believe you had Paul Humphreys recently at this symposium, so I thought I'd buy his book on emergence because it's sort of contrary to Spinozism. And even he notes, I should say, and I'll just quote this to you, on page 16 in the preamble, he writes, when phenomena such as consciousness and perceptual qualia are proposed as examples of emergence, not to mention even more esoteric cases such as souls, the current state of scientific knowledge in neuroscience is insufficient to assess whether these are genuine cases of emergence. I mean, the notion that mind emerged from matter is ancient, but in Britain we had this, from John Stuart Mill really to C.D. Broad, we had this collection of British emergentists who argued for this. Then it went out of fashion mid-20th century with identity theory, functionalism, and so on. And but then it came back again in the 70s, 80s. But really, it's for Spinoza. Then it's very problematic. We don't have any transordinal laws to explain it. It's not like liquidity emerging out of water as out of molecules, as John Stuart Mill said already in the 1830s. I think it's very different because you cannot trace the emergence, and for various other reasons. So there cannot be emergence. Scientifically, at least, or at least we're not at that stage yet, and I don't think we ever will be in principle. Mental causation is also very problematic. How does mind affect physical matter? I mean, this is based on a Cartesian framework that these are two separate things, even if one's an epiphenomena of the other. This is very problematic. But you don't want to deny mental causation, otherwise intelligence would have no evolutionary role at all. So you get in Jaegwon Kim, especially in his book Physicalism or something near enough, you get him basically saying, like, well, emergence is the best we got, but it doesn't really make sense. And but you see, Spinoza offers this great solution, which is simply that there is no upward causation emergence, there's no downward causation, mental causation, rather mind and matter are one, so you get simply psychophysical to psychophysical causation. And that's why we get neural correlates of consciousness, because they are the same thing. And you would get correlates of consciousness as well in plants, but of course plants can't report their feelings. But so what's the default view? Do you assume that they have no sentience whatsoever, or do you assume that they do and we can't access it, like really we can't access other people's perspectives? So the Cartesian view would then, and we see this in science. I mean, I saw an article yesterday that said something like pigeon. It's now believed that pigeons might have a form of consciousness. I mean, why would you assume they didn't? I mean, what is the axiom that says they don't have consciousness and we have to prove that they? With a Spinoza's legacy, you'd still get the science, you'd still see correlates, but you'd understand those correlates in other ways, and perhaps you'd be able to form more interesting hypotheses. So anyway, I think my time's up, but there you go. Spinozism as a solution to the world's woes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Such a wonderful and enlightening lecture delivered by you. Definitely, our scholars and teachers must have benefited out of your lecture. At the same time, there would be certain doubts, certain queries. So I request Dr. Sahana that she would, is there anybody? I think Mr. Sujit Babul has.
Yeah.
Sujit Babul has raised hand. Mr. Sujit Babul, you can ask your question directly.
So I think he had raised his hand a little earlier. Professor Aditya, would you, like Peter, what would you prefer? There are some questions in the chat also, Professor Aditya. So would you prefer to read that, Peter, and then answer them, or how would you like to go?
I don't mind really. Yes, I don't normally use. Okay, yeah, I can go through the questions in the chat if you like, to start with.
Is that okay, Professor Aditya?
Yeah, it's okay.
Thank you.
Right, okay. Mute microphones, we welcome everyone. Okay, that's it. Do you see a point of similarity? Here's a first question then. Do you see point of similarity between Spinoza's monism and Advaita Vedanta? Now, this is where I already made my excuses and said, this is something that I really want to look into. I have I've been told that there are points of similarities, but it's just not my field. So I'd be very interested to hear anyone explain any points of similarities with what I've said. I'll just say this in passing, that I got into philosophy because my father had a book of Indian philosophy, Gnana Yoga, it's called. And I read that as a teenager, and that's what started off. And I wanted to study Eastern philosophy in England, but it did not exist at the time. It does now. So I went into Western philosophy. But it seems that I'm heading back again. I see that on the horizon. But no, at the moment, I'm afraid I can't answer that question. Second question. You mentioned that science has an outlook that is very Christian. I take this to mean a substantialist ontology, where for Christianity, God is the highest being, and for science, it is particle or strings. This is not different from Spinoza, who would say nature is the highest being, monism. Now, insofar as one asserts a being as highest, whether a particle, God, or nature, isn't one playing the same game of a substantialist ontology? Of course, given the differences in how that plays out. Well, yes. It is a substantialist ontology. I mean, the ultimate form of it, really, that reality is a substance. And for Spinoza, as I said, that substance in itself is immutable, perfect, and therefore unchanging. That's why God has no sufferings, passions, because he can't change from one state of perfection to a lower one. I would agree there's a substantialist ontology, but then in between your lines, I realized that you say that as a criticism. I mean, if you look at Whitehead's philosophy, famously process philosophy, the argument is one against substantialist ontology, but that's really directed towards Aristotle and the way of looking at philosophy in terms of subjects and predicates, substances and attributes, in a traditional sense. In passing, Whitehead said, you can see Spinoza's substance as my fluctuating process. So there's a very interesting comparison to be written about. Basile, Pier Francesco Basile has written a little bit about it. But yeah, no, it is a substantialist ontology. There is eternity there, ultimately. I'm just trying to link that to Christianity then. I take this to mean substantial. Well, for Christian God. So isn't one playing the same game as Christianity as this fundamental substance? Well, in a way, I guess, yes. And that's why I do actually see Whitehead as a superior philosopher who's taken on board evolutionism as a process. But although you can see similarities between Spinoza and Christianity, I think ultimately there's more differences than similarities to look at. Third question. Spinoza talks about intellectual love of God. Is intellectual love conceivable? Well, no, because the intellectual love of God is the third kind of knowledge that Spinoza talks about, and conceivability is part of the second kind of knowledge, reason and science. So you can't conceive it. You can talk about it, and it refers to something of which you would have little idea unless you have actually experienced it. Now, there's an interesting case to be made comparing the intellectual love of God, this state of becoming one, as it were, with the infinite intellect, with other altered states of consciousness that one sees in mystics down the ages. And this has been done. And it's also very interesting to see interpretations of Spinoza in this way, because in one sense, a lot of philosophers see Spinoza as the ultimate rationalist, ultimate parsimony, monism. There's no transcendental God, no soul after death. This is very in accord with our general secular belief systems here in Britain. But in another, some people see Spinoza as a mystic. He ultimately talks about this intellectual love of God. It all leads to this final point, peak experience, which really explains the whole. It's a sort of intuition of the whole pantheistic, monistic, eternal entity. Some people dismiss the intellectual love of God as something inconsistent in Spinoza. Other people see it as fundamentally crucial, the final centerpiece where it all led to. I take more the latter view, but this is a matter of debate. What is, the intellectual love of God? There's more of it in my video, a little bit more. It's in the last book of the Ethics, the 5th part. It's a very interesting read. Next question. The Indian mystic Aurobindo mentioned that freedom is an absence of necessity, but Spinoza believes that a sense of freedom means that everything is necessary. Could you comment on this? Freedom is an absence of necessity. Well, there is a strange paradoxical harmony here, a compatibility, which is that for Spinoza, freedom is achieved when one is not controlled by the passions, the emotions. The ultimate tranquility of mind is achieved by escaping from bondage of the passions, as he says. So it is, in that sense, an absence of necessity. You're not necessarily determined by your feelings. Reason takes over, and this leads to peace of mind, as I say. At the same time, however, this freedom is achieved by understanding that everything is necessary, ironically. So one understands that, for example, someone's angry and about something, one could react angrily towards that. But if you see the causes of that anger, you can understand, you can sympathize with them, and you can deal with it rationally rather than emotionally. This kind of freedom. But of course, your understanding their anger as determined is also something that is determined. You are not really, there's nothing that could freely change your reaction to anything. But of course, here's another interesting thing, that just because there's no free will does not mean there's no mental causation. There is mental causation, but it is determined. Why? Because mental causation is the parallel of physical causation. So what we understand by physical causation in physics, we know through know part of through our own consciousness. So there's no free will, but there is mental causation, but mental causation is determined, is not free. Because a lot of people think free will and mental causation are the same thing. And interestingly, in Spinoza, we see a difference. I don't have a question as of now. I pressed the button by mistake. Okay. Can you elaborate on the differences between Whitehead and Spinoza's metaphysics of freedom, I guess, in relation to will, creativity? That's a huge question. Ultimately, for Whitehead, creativity is the fundamental tenet of his whole metaphysics, above God even, for Whitehead. It's something that even God is conditioned by. Here's the main difference, really. So for Spinoza, following in a theological tradition, from Maimonides mostly, probably, and his legacy. Maimonides lived in the 12th century. God must be perfect. Therefore, the world couldn't be otherwise. If the world is God, then of course that must be perfect. It must be determined. The laws of nature must be constant. Now, for Whitehead, he doesn't follow that theological tradition, this ontological argument, and he rather believes that the laws of change, the so-called laws of nature, change over time. In other words, he believes that even the laws of nature are in flux. They are evolving themselves. They're changing themselves. And the so-called laws of nature are an abstraction that really relate to the changing nature of what we understand by mind and matter, which for Whitehead are the same thing as well, really. So there's no ultimate laws of nature that determine the way things behave, although there are habits which can last billions of years for Whitehead. But for Whitehead, he's under no compulsion to find a perfect being. Therefore, he allows for freedom, and it's very interesting, which means that there's a level of freedom that can be attained by humans as well. We're not the laws of nature, as I say, are like human laws. They change as well, really. So you could still use the same term as long as you realize the relativity of human laws. Constant of nature would be too strong. And I know that many physicists today don't necessarily believe in constants of nature. So that's the main difference. But like I said, you could write several books on the difference here of freedom. I mean, the whole free will determinism debate, as you all know, is a very old one, and I'm sure it will persist for many, many millennia. Next question. Deleuze suggests that we remain too infantilized by Cartesianism, etc., to be Spinozist. Do you share this view, particularly on matters of ecological politics? Yes, I mean, infantilized is quite a strong term, but ultimately I do. Deleuze has got, I should say, two very good books on Spinoza. One is called Spinoza Practical Philosophy. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. The other one is called Expressionism in Philosophy, Spinozism, or Spinoza. And that's okay, but it's not as good. Deleuze is not really a Spinoza scholar. He's more a philosopher who uses Spinoza for his own ends, as Nietzsche did as well. You know, and there's a difference between scholarship and philosophy, really. Scholarship is a part of philosophy, but not the end. So, do we remain infantilized by Cartesianism? Yeah, in one way, we haven't matured to see an identity, a monism. That seems to me to be the more rational view of reality. So in that sense, infantilized, yes. Next question. Could you say a little more about the notion of supposedly inanimate objects consciousness? What is it like to be a scoop of ice cream? Okay, so you get the classic, how can you say a chair can be conscious? So, well, within modern panpsychism, and really compatibly, Spinoza doesn't talk much about what we today call panpsychism or parallelism. He does talk about it explicitly in parts, but it's nothing he dwells on. But there is a lot of dwelling on it later on by Whitehead, for example, and Galen Strawson today, and Thomas Nagel, and Fechner, Gustav Fechner, and so on. There's a lot of good panpsychists out there, Bertrand Russell even, in some aspects. Bruno, who died, it was all, you know, it was burnt at the stake. Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake in the year 1600, just before Spinoza was born. He was arguably a panpsychist, and he made the distinction between, this is very important for panpsychism, there's a very important distinction between the units of subjectivity and aggregates. So, and this, I don't think is fully determined. The criterion for this hasn't been fully determined. But for Spinoza, conatus then is the essential aspect of a unit of subjectivity, this desire to persevere in its own being. For Whitehead, he calls it actual entities. Leibniz calls it monads. Arthur Koestler calls it holons, right? You have... Bruno talks about the fact that you couldn't say a piece of clothing like this shirt is conscious. It's an aggregate of conscious entities. So, but how do you define a unit then? Well, this is like, one thing is a central conatus then, for example. There are aspects of maintaining oneself, like an organism does. Bila autopoiesis in the life sciences. Varela talks about the unit of life being autopoietic. But it's even more fundamental than that. So we don't say that, Spinozists don't say a scoop of ice cream has consciousness. That would have a myriad of sentiences, subjectivities, not even consciousness is too strong. That would go down to those units that are self-preserving, so the molecules, for example, in this case. Whitehead calls his philosophy the philosophy of organism, because he says everything, ultimately, every unit is an organism. There's no real distinction between the animate and the inanimate. He says physics, what does he say? Biology is the study of the larger organisms, and physics is a study of the smaller organisms. And of course, this cutoff point between the animate and the inanimate, or life and the lifeless, is very difficult. And it's, again, more parsimonious to see it as a matter of degree. Anyway, again, that's something that can be spoken about, and there are many papers on this to look at. But it is a very important question, this distinction. Is your view of Spinoza influenced by Deleuze? A little bit, I'd say, sorry. A little bit. I mean, I do like Deleuze's work, and I do like Deleuze's Nietzschean interpretation of Spinoza. So yes, in that sense, I am, although I must say I had a similar interpretation of Spinoza before I read Deleuze's interpretation, so I don't know the level of influence really. Maybe he's solidified it a little bit more. with the understanding that the interpretation of Spinoza has fashions through the ages that you can trace. As I mentioned, atheism, pantheism. He was seen as a materialist for a while, and then as an idealist, and then now interest in Spinoza has come back in the last 15 years, really. But there are certain people who see him as a materialist, still atheist. I don't. But this is a matter of interpretation. And also the ultimate point from my point of view is not what Spinoza said. Truth was the truth of the matter. Right, next question. You mentioned Spinoza's exploration of what we would now call subconscious. Could you say something more about this? By his exploration of the subconscious, do you mean nothing more than Spinoza's notion that there are causes that affect us, but we don't know? And two, can you say more about Spinoza's view about the positive aspects of error, such as the error that one may mistakenly think the sun is 200 feet away? What specifically is positive about this? Okay, first question about the subconscious then. I mean, the word is not used by Spinoza, of course. He used very theological words, but he does talk about our conscious decisions being affected by us from causes of which we are unaware. And this is really the beginning of, and also he talks about how we can, as I say, try to eliminate suffering from anxiety and anger and melancholy and whatever, by understanding that whatever the causes are, even though we're not conscious of them, they are nonetheless necessary, and so on. So, so in one sense, yeah, there are causes that affect us, but we don't know. But in another sense, he's also, you can also almost be seen as a therapist in the sense that he tells us how to avoid negative emotions. For example, he says one should, when one suffers something, one should disconnect the cause of that suffering from the emotion itself, and that begins the process of therapy. One can focus merely on the feeling rather than whoever dismissed you or whatever it may be. Secondly, can you say more about Spinoza's view about the positive aspects of error, such as the error that one may mistakenly think the sun is 200 feet away? What specifically is positive about this? I don't really think he does necessarily say that, unless I'm missing something. Whitehead, though, talks about the positive aspects of error, as does Nietzsche, and says that, you know, error is making mistakes is the price of progress, trial and error. Yeah, so I can't really answer that second question properly, I'm afraid. Next question. If everything in existence is nature or God, so the thought of destroying nature should also be God or nature? Yes, that's right. Well, we are all part of God from Spinoza's point of view. So if one did have the desire to destroy nature, then that would be an aspect of God. And I should say this as well. Spinoza is no kind of moralist, really. I mean, he's good and evil, something I didn't talk about, but I'll say this here. Good and evil for Spinoza are completely relative to the conatus. And that's, in other words, relative to one's own survival, perseverance, and really advancement, if you look at an earlier book. So there's no ultimate good or evil that is transcendent of nature, because there is no such transcendental reality. And this is another reason why he got into trouble. Also, you know, because of course he would deny that there are any God-given rights or wrongs. This is why Nietzsche liked him to start with, at least, you know, going beyond good and evil. Although, of course, Spinoza does say that, you know, for one's self-interest, one should live in a civilized society, and so on and so forth. But, and he even says, I mean, this is in the theological political treatise, there should be a noble lie that such things are absolute and exist. But for philosophers, we know that these are really just a way of not controlling, but of maintaining a peaceful civilization in which we can progress in ourselves. Any thoughts on Bergson's notion of duration and freedom and Spinoza's determinism? Are there points of divergence or intersection? Very interesting comparison. It's really too much for me to say, but I mean, ostensibly they seem completely at odds with each other. So Bergson criticizes the Minkowski-Einstein notion that time is a fourth dimension of space, and generally Bergson's raison d'etre in many ways is to say that science has misunderstood time. It sees time as a line, whereas really it's a fluctuating experience. This is the concrete. The timeline is something abstract. That does, and therefore he allows for freedom, because the laws of nature and time as a static line are abstractions, not concrete realities. How does that relate to Spinoza's determinism? Well, it does seem ostensibly contradictory. And like I said, I think that you can still maintain Spinoza's mind-matter monism without maintaining his absolute determinism. But that is really huge question, very interesting one. Someone hopefully has written a PhD thesis about it. My questions: 1, David Chalmers states in Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness in 95 that, quote, the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there's a well of information processing, but there's also a subjective aspect. As Nagel, 74, puts it, there is something it is like to be a conscious organism. To me, Chalmers is presupposing dualism because he uses experience in a Cartesian sense. Yes, I mean, like I originally said, Chalmers' 1995 presentation of the hard problem of consciousness does have this that aspect, this dualism already, quite right. But to be fair on Chalmers is very recently has been written some very good papers on panpsychism, and is very sympathetic to it. But the way Chalmers operates, as you might know, is that he's very listy, right? There's a lot of lists about things, the pros and cons of anything, and he doesn't really adopt his own philosophy, but he's very good at analyzing lots of positions. And I think, yeah, I mean, he's quite aware of the axioms that he uses. He tries to be explicit about it. But for me, his style is too listy, like I say, and I think he's more a commentator than a great thinker. Continuation of question 1. Whereas the notion of experience in Kant is not a dualist one, and definitely not in Spinoza, so would you say that Spinoza preempts the hard problem of consciousness rather than offering a monistic solution to it? Yeah, well, what is the solution? Perhaps the solution is a resolution by questioning the axioms of the problems in the first place. Does he preempt the hard problem of consciousness? Well, yes, I mean, like, related to the question above, I mean, hard problem of consciousness comes from this dualistic aspect, doesn't it? That there are two things, how are they related? However, so in the one sense, by saying they're the same, then he says, well, therefore, that's how they're related. The relation is identity. However, why is that the case? You have to go into a lot of detail as to why you see matter and mind as ultimately the same thing. Now, this is where other modern thinkers help Spinoza's case, I believe, especially, again, Whitehead. So Whitehead, Russell, who was Whitehead's student and then friend, he writes that Whitehead is the master of what shall I say, exposing abstractions. So Russell and Whitehead both were mathematicians as well. In other words, the sort of the workings of the abstractions. Whitehead shows that matter, what we understand by matter, is an abstraction. It's another word, but by abstraction, it doesn't mean a universal, transcendent universal. He means a part of the truth that is reified into the whole truth. This he calls the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So when we understand matter, how do we perceive matter? We perceive matter by our senses, which for Whitehead are much more than the traditional 5. And we can measure it, we can measure its weight, and we can take its temperature, measure its gravity even perhaps, and so on and so forth. But how do we know that's all there is to it? You know, a thermometer does not measure the color of its surrounding. It only measures the heat. But of course, that doesn't mean that there's no color around it. Likewise with any being, like humans. We are very limited, and this is where evolution comes in. We are very limited in our understanding of perceiving reality. And we should be careful not to mistake what we see, like a physical object, with its concrete reality. There is much more to things we perceive than the way we perceive it. And so for Whitehead, an intrinsic aspect of all matter then is sentience, and that's how his that's how the monism comes into play, and that's how you can use Whitehead to substantiate that Spinozist monism. Right. Okay, there are 4 more points here. My second question, this is about the emergence of the term consciousness, not of the emergence of consciousness. It seems to me that the term consciousness has emerged to bring back dualism after a century of physicalism from 19th to 20th century. Surely neither Descartes nor Spinoza in Latin use the word consciousness. So how do we read the contemporary pseudo-problem consciousness to Spinoza or even Descartes? Yes. So how do we read the contemporary pseudo-problem consciousness to Spinoza, even Descartes? About the emergence of the term consciousness, not of the emergence of consciousness. Okay. That's an interesting philological issue. One aspect here is the fact that consciousness has many meanings, and in panpsychist circles, when you say that a plant has consciousness, people often misunderstand that by thinking, well, consciousness is a very complex thing where we think about the past and the future and present environment as we see it, and so on and so forth. And it's consciousness is, by definition, conscious. In other words, one is aware of it. Whereas, of course, for Spinoza's panpsychism, this is only one aspect. He calls it thought, following Descartes, but this is only one aspect of sentience. Sentience is a much better word, I think, which comes from the word feeling, really. It's an umbrella term. Consciousness, I think, should be used for only the higher levels of reflective thought, of contrast. Whitehead says, when you can think of what could be rather than what is, that is consciousness. And philosophy of mind, we have this distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Access consciousness means awareness, really, and phenomenal consciousness is more about the subconscious, or things of which things which one perceives but is not aware of, such as, for example, the window over there. It's in my visual periphery, but I'm not thinking about it, or wasn't, at least until I mentioned it. So the word consciousness, yes, is very, very problematic. I don't know the etymology of it perfectly, though, so I'll move on. If intellectual love of God is inconceivable, how do we talk about it? It also urges to explain how can the term intellectual and love be put side by side. How do we talk about it? Well, one aspect of if the intellectual love of God is a mystical experience, as some commentators believe it is, then that experience is ineffable. So ineffability is one of the 4 criteria of the mystical state from William James, famously. Although Plato wrote about that in the 7th letter 2,500 years ago. Everything's footnote to Plato, as Whitehead said. So we can't talk about it in detail, but we can point towards it. It also urges us to explain how can the term intellectual and love be put side by side. Well, it is a strange term, I must admit, because it's not, God cannot love people, as I said, and intellectual love is not emotional love. I look at it like this: it's an intellectual love of God because it's a fusion of the finite intellect with the infinite intellectual, and it's a love because it's a bonding. It's not a passion, it's not an emotion. So it's, a lot of people criticize Spinoza for the words he uses. I mean, mostly the word God for nature. And he uses, as I say, a lot of theological language. And the reason for that is to kind of get past the Christian censors of his time. He even calls the will to power providence, which it made me laugh when I came across that. Let's see here. If Spinoza was to read and understand the Vedanta school of the Indian philosophy, then which school of thought, in your opinion, would he have preferred, seconding with the most? Again, I plead ignorance with the Vedanta school of Indian philosophy, something that I intend to look into when I've finished my current projects. Okay, good. I'm satisfied with the answer. I'm preempting the problem of consciousness. Okay, thank you. Expressive causality or parallel causation, or some mix of both. Which would be a better categorization for the dynamicity in Spinoza? Expressive causality or parallel causation? I wouldn't call it parallel causation, because that, although it's called parallelism, I prefer the word panpsychism because, again, it's a parallelization of attributes, expressions of one thing. The causation itself is monistic. It's psychophysical to psychophysical causation, as far as humans are aware, because we only see those two attributes, thought and extension, psychological and the physical. So yeah, you know, like a word like parallel causation, in one sense it makes sense, but in another sense it could lead people astray. I mean, he himself doesn't use a word for the causality, for the causation, which would be better. I would say expressive or parallel causation. I couldn't choose between them. I'll think about that. Next question. The meanings of consciousness beg the question of what one is pushing, such as dualism. Hard problem consciousness is raised by Chalmers without giving any argument for whether there is a consensus of what consciousness means. True. I would use the word consciousness the way it is used in medicine, and this has to do with the body. Yeah, one of the big classifying or describing consciousness is the remit of phenomenology. And there's very good work there, especially by Husserl, Edmund Husserl, of course. But his work is, I mean, it's vast. And consciousness itself, as we said before, might exclude subconsciousness. So again, I think sentience is a better word. A lot of these problems are based upon misunderstandings of words. So when you use the same word and two different people coming to the same question have completely different understandings of them. And one has so to start with, one always has to clarify terms, but that is endless. You can never fully, of course, clarify a term because using other terms, which have the same problem ad infinitum. I think we have to understand limits of human intellect to a certain extent here. But you're quite right. How could Chalmers talk about the hard problem consciousness without defining consciousness? I mean, he has tried. But yeah, I don't like the word consciousness really either. I try to avoid it. I would thank you for quoting. I would thank you quoting Transtroma, the poet, from your land. Tired of all come with words but no language. I went to the snow-covered island. The wild does not have words. The unwritten pages spread themselves out in all directions. I come across the marks of roe deer's hooves in the snow, language but no words. Thanks. Yes, very nice. I'll just copy and paste that so I can see it later. Thank you for that.
Okay, that's no, that's great. You covered all the questions. Dr. Aditya is here, so I'm just going to let him take over. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for such an enlightening lecture and very good responses, Professor. If you allow me, like, I can respond the very first question about Advaita and monism here, because Advaita is my area. So in one or two lines, if I say that monism starts with one, because Spinoza starts his philosophy with substance, one that which is in itself and conceived through itself. Whereas Advaita starts with diversity and it reaches to non-diversity. It does not say one, but it says non-diversity, that's it. Because Advaita is of the view that if anything is eternally one, cannot be called one. Because Shankara, who was one of the main propounder of this Advaita philosophy, he did not use the word one for, so in fact, he said, like, the reality can be expressed in a negative language, not two. So he did not use the word one, but he said not two. So basically, Advaita starts with the diversity, it reaches to non-diversity, whereas monism starts with one and it explains diversity. So both approaches are different. So this is a basic difference between, in monism, we can use a positive language, but in Advaita, positive language would be very much difficult. So again, on behalf of Department of Philosophy, I extend my thankfulness. But before I extend thankfulness to you, sir, I see that here we have one of our professor, Professor Priyadarshi Jetli ji. Like, he has been my teacher as well in the Department of Philosophy, Delhi University. So he taught, in fact, Western philosophy. So, sir, On behalf of your department, I extend thankfulness to you. And thank you very much. You, in fact, switched on your camera. So after, I would say many 15, 16 years, I'm getting opportunity to see you, though virtually, but I extend my thankfulness on behalf of your department, sir. Your blessings are there. And you remember me used to call me Aristotle. And to Sumit Nandan, one of my senior, used to call him Kant. So thank you very much, sir. Keep on blessing us and other professors who attended this conference. Our thankfulness goes to them as well. All the research scholars, all the professors who joined this and who asked questions and responses were given by Professor Peter. So on behalf of Department of Philosophy, we extend thankfulness. We are really thankful to you. We are thankful to you, our very bright scholar, Dr. Sahana. Like, though she's, handling everything, but I personally am personally thankful. Like, she's handling many things of our department. So I would say, Sahana, thankful. Like, thank you very much to you as well. Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Peter, once again, on behalf of Philosophy Department. Your lecture was